Suicide Note, by Mitchell Heisman. This work is a computer-generated reading of Suicide Note, by Mitchell Heisman. This reading was produced using Natural Reader 14, a product of Natural Soft Limited. This work is free and licensed by Mitchell Heisman for copying and distribution under a Creative Commons Attribution Non-Commercial No Derivative Works 3.0 United States license. Exordia. An experiment in nihilism. How much truth does a spirit endure, how much truth does it dare? Friedrich Nietzsche, Ecce Homo. What the hell happened to reason? The following is an experiment in nihilism. Already I have contradicted myself. How can one believe in disbelief? I might be a nihilist except that I don't believe in anything. If there is no extant God and no extant gods, no good and no evil, no right and no wrong, no meaning and no purpose, if there are no values that are inherently valuable, no justice that is ultimately justifiable, no reasoning that is fundamentally rational, then there is no sane way to choose between science, religion, racism, philosophy, nationalism, art, conservatism, nihilism, liberalism, surrealism, fascism, asceticism, egalitarianism, subjectivism, elitism, ismism. If reason is incapable of deducing ultimate, non-arbitrary human ends, and nothing can be judged as ultimately more important than anything else, then freedom is equal to slavery, cruelty is equal to kindness, love is equal to hate, war is equal to peace, dignity is equal to contempt, destruction is equal to creation, life is equal to death and death is equal to life. For why has the advent of nihilism become necessary, asked Friedrich Nietzsche? Because the values we have had hitherto thus draw their final consequence, because nihilism represents the ultimate logical conclusion of our great values and ideals, because we must experience nihilism before we can find out what value these values really had. Was Nietzsche right? An absurd question that constitutes the crisis of an internally collapsed Western civilization. In the words of Leo Strauss, the crisis of modernity reveals itself in the fact, or consists in the fact, that modern Western man no longer knows what he wants, that he no longer believes that he can know what is good and bad, what is right and wrong. Until a few generations ago, it was generally taken for granted that man can know what is right and wrong, what is the just or the good or the best order of society, in a word, that political philosophy is possible and necessary. In our time this faith has lost its power. Above all, as is generally admitted, modern culture is emphatically rationalistic, believing in the power of reason. Surely if such a culture loses its faith in reason's ability to validate its highest aims, it is in a crisis. Uncertain of uncertainty, skeptical of skepticism, it seems that the most important question is whether there is an important question. The only serious question is whether there is anything to take seriously. What has previously been considered of value or importance appears as only an expression of myth, bias, error. Open your mind to death. There is a very popular opinion that choosing life is inherently superior to choosing death. This belief that life is inherently preferable to death is one of the most widespread superstitions. This bias constitutes one of the most obstinate mythologies of the human species. This prejudice against death, however, is a kind of xenophobia. Discrimination against death is simply assumed good and right. Absolutist faith in life is commonly a result of the unthinking conviction that existence or survival, along with an irrational fear of death, is good. This unreasoned conviction in the rightness of life over death is like a god or a mass delusion. Life is the noble lie, the common secular religion of the West. For the conventional Westerner, the obvious leap of faith to make here is that oneself and its preservation constitute the first measure of rationality. Yet if one begins reasoning with the unquestioned premise that life is good, or that one's own life or any life is justified, this is very different from bringing that premise itself to be questioned rationally. Anyone who has ever contemplated his or her own mortality might question the ultimate sanity of the premise of self-preservation. Even if it is possible to live forever, moreover, this makes not an iota of difference as to the question of the value of existence. Most people are so prejudiced on this issue that they simply refuse to even consider the possibilities of death. Humans tend to be so irrationally prejudiced towards the premise of life that rational treatment of death seldom sees the light of day. Most people will likely fall back on their most thoughtless convictions, intuitions, and instincts, instead of attempting to actually think through their biases, much less overcome them. Yet is choosing death irrational? For what reason? For most people, irrationality apparently refers to a subjectivity experience in which their fear of death masters them as opposed to the discipline of mastering one's fear of death. By irrational, they mean that they feel compelled to bow down before this master. An individual is free, apparently, when he or she is too scared to question obedience to the authority of the fear of death. This unquestioned slavery to the most common and unreasonable instincts is what, in practice, liberal individualists call rationalism. Most common moral positions justify and cloak this fear of death. And like any traditional authority, time has gathered a whole system of rituals, conventions, and customs to maintain its authority and power as unquestionable, inevitable, and fated, fear of death as the true, the good, and the beautiful. For most people, fear of death is the unquestionable master that establishes all other hierarchies, both social hierarchies, and the hierarchies within one's own mind. Most are humbly grateful for the very privilege of obedience and do not want to be free. I propose opening your mind towards the liberation of death, towards exposing this blind faith in life as a myth, a bias, and an error. To overcome this delusion, the magic spell of pious reverence for life over death must be broken. To do so is to examine the faith in life that has been left unexamined, the naive secular and non-secular faith in life over death. Opening one's mind to death emerges from the attempt to unshackle one's mind from the limitations of all borders. It leads to overcoming all biological boundaries, including borders between the self and the larger world. It reaches towards the elimination of biologically based prejudices altogether, including prejudice towards biological self-preservation. The attempt to go beyond ethnocentrism and anthropomorphism leads towards overcoming the prejudices of what I call viviocentrism, or life-centeredness. Just as overcoming ethnocentrism requires recognition of the provincialism of ethnic values, overcoming viviocentrism emerges from the recognition of the provincialism of life values. Viviocentric provincialism is exposed through an enlarged view from our planet, our solar system, our galaxy, and the limits of our knowledge of the larger cosmos we live in. Overcoming the prejudice against death, then, is only an extension and continuation of the Western project of eliminating bias, especially biologically based biases, i.e. race or sex-based biases. The liberation of death is only the next step in the political logic that has hitherto sought to overcome prejudices based on old assumptions of a fixed biological human nature. Its opposite is an Aristotelian, teleological conception of nature, a nature of natural slaves, natural aristocracy, natural patriarchy, natural inferiority of women, natural racial kinds, natural heterosexuality and, finally, natural self-preservation. This older, teleological view suggests that individual self-preservation is an expression of a fixed biologically based nature that culture and/or reason is incapable of changing, altering, or overcoming. Just as it was considered unnatural or even insane that men be loosed from natural subordination to their king, or that women be unchained from natural subordination to their fathers and husbands, today it is considered unnatural that death be liberated from its natural subordination to the tyranny of life. From this point of view, one can recognize that the pro-choice stance on abortion and the right to die stance on euthanasia have already opened paths over conventional pro-life superstitions. These developments towards the liberation of biological death may lead to what may be the highest fulfillment of egalitarian progress, the equality of life and death. Further liberations of death should challenge one's convictions in the same way that egalitarianisms of the past have challenged common assumptions and convictions, the equality of all men, the equality of the races, the equality of the sexes, the equality of sexual orientations, the equality of the biological and physical, and the equality of life and death. Overcoming the will to live, then, represents one of the final steps in overcoming the provincial and primitive life instincts probably inherited from our evolutionary past, i.e. inclinations towards patriarchy, authoritarianism, sexism, kynism, and racism. It is not only a contribution to civilization but a culmination of the progress of civilization, that is, the application of reason to human existence. Only when the will to live itself is civilized, can one be free to acknowledge that reason itself does not dictate a bias towards life. Having come so far, the unquestioned viviocentrism of the West can no longer hold. As George Steiner foresaw in his tentative prospectus for the post-cultural West, we open the successive doors in Bluebeard's castle because they are there, because each leads to the next by a logic of intensification which is that of the mind's own awareness of being. To leave one door closed would be not only cowardice but a betrayal radical, self-mutilating of the inquisitive, probing, forward-tense stance of our species. We are hunters after reality, wherever it may lead. The risk, the disasters incurred are flagrant. But so is, or has been until very recently, the axiomatic assumption and a priori of our civilization, which holds that man and truth are companions, that their roads lie forward and are dialectically cognate. We cannot turn back. We cannot choose the dreams of unknowing. We shall, I expect, open the last door in the castle even if it leads, perhaps because it leads, onto realities which are beyond the reach of human comprehension and control. We shall do so with that desolate clairvoyance, so marvelously rendered in Bartók's music, because opening doors is the tragic merit of our identity. Evil, base, and insane. In a polemic against the value relativism implicit in the work of sociologist Max Weber, Leo Strauss wrote, "I contend that Weber's thesis necessarily leads to nihilism or to the view that every preference, however evil, base, or insane, has to be judged before the tribunal of reason to be as legitimate as any other preference." Most liberal Democrats have not appreciated Leo Strauss's serious search for the good, the best, and the sane. But perhaps some will when faced with certain alternatives. Should the truth be openly pursued, no matter what, even if it kills us? The problem of philosophy is that the paradoxes of nihilism may constitute the most universal condition or highest principle that rational thought has progressed. At the very pinnacle of rational Western thought lays the proposition that life is meaningless. Is this the most comprehensive insight that human reason is capable? Is this the fundamental conclusion that every experience, all knowledge, and every moment of living existence must come to terms with? If the rational life leads to the nihilistic life, what are the consequences of a living intelligence whose highest organizing principle is this hypothetical nothingness? What would it mean, in concrete terms, to live a rational life according the insight of the nihilistic? What would be the ultimate consequence of applying the hypothesis of unmeaning to every belief, every thought, every action, every emotion, every purpose, and every goal? To nausea, to fear, to love, to terror? Can one live a philosophy of the nihilistic, reconciling meaninglessness with every thought and emotion at every moment? If active unbelief were the highest organizing principle of a life, would the consequence be rational self-destruction? Could suicide represent the pinnacle of the rational life realized? How far I can draw the implications of nihilism to life? To actively answer this question would constitute an experiment in nihilism, nihilism as a foundational premise for life. Nihilism as the highest organizing principle of a life. Such an experiment in nihilism would be an experiment in Western rational empiricism, for nihilism appears to be the cumulative consequence of the scientific approach to life. Nihilism is where science and philosophy meet. Is the proposition that life is meaningless a meaningful statement? Underlying the utterance I don't believe are innumerable assumptions, unconscious impulses, and chance happenings. The disbeliever contradicts himself or herself in the very living impulses that make possible that assertion of disbelief. This contradiction cannot be eradicated within the framework of an examined life because it is the condition of that life. Nihilism could be interpreted as the inherent paradox of living a belief in disbelief. So-called nihilism, however, is more unbelief than belief in disbelief. Unbelief is a condition reached through negation. It is not a positive expression of belief in disbelief, but rather, the negative cumulative result of refuting and recognizing the groundlessness of any and every instance of belief encountered thus far, lack of justification for belief in the authority of the state, lack of justification for belief in the authority of one's instincts and emotions, and lack of justification for belief that God exists. From a rationalistic view, belief in disbelief is self-contradictory. Yet I have yet to find a reason to think that there exists any sufficiently well-developed system of thought that is not fundamentally self-contradictory. From purely rationalistic view, nihilism is self-contradictory, the nihilistic self-destructs. This is another way of looking at the postmodern self-destruction of reason. If rationalism leads to nihilism, and nihilism leads to disbelief in reason, then rationalism leads to the self-destruction of reason. If the philosopher maintains a life according to reason or as an embodiment of reason, then does reason lead the philosopher to self-destruct? Unbelieving in nihilism, I confront unbelief without believing in it. Because unbelief, so defined, is not an abstract position, but the result of discerning a lack of ground for the various instances of belief I encounter, an experiment in nihilism so conceived amounts, not to the paradoxes of rational argument, but an empirical demonstration of the lack of ground for instances of belief. So instead of a purely rational argument, I will design and conduct an experiment to test the proposition of the meaninglessness of life. How far I can develop a nihilistic worldview or a nihilistic life. I can posit death to empirically test the implications of the nihilistic proposition. Actualizing a hypothetical death could experimentally test the consequences of a hypothetical nihilism. Willing death is, then, an attempt to live a nihilistic life. The nihilistic is increasingly present, but who values that life has no value? What if nobody happens to value truths such as this? Almost every non-believer slips comfortably into the unreflective prejudices towards life, using nihilism to justify glossing over nihilism. Yet if there is literally no basis for choosing one value over another value, can one posit literally any value whatsoever? If life is truly without purpose, then no choice can have ultimate grounds that are more justifiable than any other. If so, then there are no grounds for the claim that willing life is superior to the choice of willing death. If fundamental values or goals are wholly arbitrary, is it possible to choose rational self-destruction over rational self-preservation? If no values are inherently valuable, then life has no inherent value. If life has no inherent purpose, then its end could be directed towards its negation or death. Death could be posited as the highest value. Since the other secular values are premised upon life, death is the test of all the others. To test life with death tests the most important question I can conceive of, whether there is an important question. It tests importance itself, whether there is anything at all that can be judged important. Willing death is taking unbelief seriously by taking seriously the possibility that there is truly nothing to take seriously. Only by ruthlessly exposing the comfortable biases towards existence can one reckon with the implications of the valuelessness of existence. Challenging every living value by willing death is how I will test this question, and how I will test this question is the experiment in nihilism. The implications of life's meaninglessness have not been elicited with sufficient ruthlessness. My methodology is honesty to the point of absurdity, honesty without mercy, honesty unprejudiced by morals, aesthetics, faith, or hope. When all illusions have been dispelled, at the end of overcoming subjectivities, biases, and prejudices towards life, one encounters the possibility of rational negation of self-interest, rational self-annihilation, rational self-destruction. The experiment in nihilism is to seek out precisely those truths that are most deadly and destructive to me. To will death through truth and truth through death.